Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown, where the cozy warmth of Christmas takes a chilling turn. Tonight, we dive into spine-tingling tales of sinister snowmen, stories that turn the innocent symbol of winter into a harbinger of fear. From glowing red eyes to eerie whispers in the night, these snowmen aren't here to spread holiday cheer. So dim the lights, wrap yourself in a warm blanket, and prepare for a frosty journey into the unknown. Story number 1. I never thought a simple scarf could become the centerpiece of a nightmare, but that Christmas proved me wrong. It was the winter of '85, and the chill cut deeper than usual in our small Montana town. My family had always struggled to make ends meet, but that year was particularly tough. Dad had lost his job at the mill, and Mom did what she could by sewing and mending clothes for neighbors. Christmas decorations were a luxury we couldn't afford. "Can we at least build a snowman?" my little brother Tommy asked, his eyes wide with hope. Dad managed a weary smile. "Of course, champ, there's plenty of snow outside." We spent the afternoon packing snow into 3 uneven balls, stacking them carefully in our tiny front yard. Tommy found some rocks for the eyes and mouth, and Mom donated 2 buttons from an old coat for the torso. The snowman looked lopsided but cheerful. "He needs a scarf," Tommy declared. Dad hesitated before unwinding the faded woolen scarf from around his neck. It was his favorite, a gift from Grandpa before he passed. "Here you go," he said softly, wrapping it around the snowman's neck. "Are you sure?" Mom whispered. Dad nodded. "It's Christmas. Let him have it." As dusk settled, we retreated indoors. The house was modest, a small living room that flowed into a cramped kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom that groaned with the plumbing of decades past. The heater struggled against the biting cold, so we huddled under blankets in the living room, sipping on thin vegetable soup. Later that night, after Tommy had fallen asleep on the couch, I noticed Dad staring out the window, his brow furrowed. "Everything okay?" I asked. He blinked, turning toward me. "Yeah, just thought I saw something." "What?" He shook his head. "Nothing." My eyes playing tricks on me. I glanced out the window but saw only the faint outline of the snowman under the dim streetlight. The scarf fluttered gently in the wind. "Time for bed," Mom announced, herding us toward our rooms. I shared a room with Tommy. As we settled into our beds, he whispered, "Do you think Santa will come tonight?" I forced a smile. "Of course. Maybe he'll bring you that toy train you wanted." He grinned before closing his eyes, but I knew the odds were slim. Sometime past midnight, a soft rustling noise stirred me from sleep. I sat up, listening intently. The house was silent except for the occasional creak. Just as I was about to lie back down, I heard it again, a gentle crunching sound, like footsteps on fresh snow. I crept to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The yard was bathed in a pale moonlight, casting long shadows. My breath fogged the glass as I scanned the area. The snowman was gone. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was still half asleep. But the spot where the snowman had stood was empty, only a rough mound of disturbed snow remaining. A flicker of movement caught my eye near the edge of our property. I squinted, making out a figure moving slowly. It was the snowman, except it was no longer stationary. It shuffled awkwardly across the yard, Dad's scarf clenched in one stick-like hand. Waving it gently, a chill colder than any winter wind ran down my spine. "Mom! Dad!" I hissed, tearing myself away from the window. I dashed into the hallway, nearly colliding with Dad. "What's wrong?" he asked, alarmed. "The snowman, it's moving." He stared at me for a moment before sighing. "You've had a bad dream. Let's get you back to bed." "No, I saw it. It's in the yard." Mom appeared behind him, her eyes heavy with sleep. "What's going on?" "She thinks she saw the snowman moving," Dad explained wearily. "I didn't think. I know what I saw." Dad exchanged a glance with Mom. "All right, let's take a look." We went back to my room, but when we peered out the window, the yard was empty. The snowman was gone. See, I whispered. Dad frowned. Probably just collapsed. Snowmen do that. But it was moving. Mom placed a hand on my shoulder. Honey, it's late. Let's all get some sleep. We can look in the morning. Reluctantly, I agreed, though sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I rushed outside before anyone else was awake. The yard was pristine, with no footprints or signs of disturbance except for one thing. Dad's scarf lay neatly folded on the porch steps. I picked it up, the wool damp and cold. As I turned it over in my hands, a sense of unease settled over me. "Whatcha got there?" Tommy's voice startled me. I showed him the scarf. It was on the steps. He looked around. "Where's the snowman?" "I don't know." We told Mom and Dad over breakfast. Dad took the scarf, his expression unreadable. "Must have been the wind," he said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. The day passed uneventfully, but an undercurrent of tension lingered. That night, as we prepared for bed, Dad hung the scarf on a hook by the front door. "Maybe we should put it away," Mom suggested. "It's fine," Dad replied curtly. I woke again to the sound of footsteps, but this time they were heavier, more deliberate, heart-pounding. I slipped out of bed and opened the bedroom door a crack. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, a tall silhouette with unnaturally long arms. Clutched Dad's scarf in one hand, the ends dragging along the floor. I stifled a gasp. Quickly closing the door, I shook Tommy awake. "What's going on?" he mumbled. "Shoo, there's someone in the house." His eyes widened. "Who?" "I don't know." We heard the floorboards creak outside our room. The doorknob began to turn slowly. I looked around frantically for something to barricade the door, but found nothing. The door swung open with a drawn-out squeak. There, illuminated by the faint glow of the hallway nightlight, stood the snowman, or what resembled one. Its body was no longer made of snow, but a ghastly amalgamation of ice and shadow. The eyes were hollow pits, and the mouth was a gaping void. The scarf hung around its neck, the only color against its monochrome form. "Come play with me," it whispered, the voice like wind howling through bare trees. Tommy screamed. The creature lunged forward, its icy hand reaching out. I grabbed Tommy's arm, and we darted past it, racing down the hall. "Mom! Dad!" I shouted. We burst into their room, slamming the door behind us. They jolted awake. "What's happening?" Mom cried. "It's here! The snowman! It's inside!" Dad jumped out of bed, disbelief turning to alarm as the doorknob rattled violently. The door shook under the force of heavy blows. "Get in the closet," Dad ordered. We huddled together in the cramped space, hearts pounding. The pounding stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. "Maybe it's gone," Mom whispered. The door exploded inward, shards of wood scattering across the room. The creature stood in the doorway, its form twisting and contorting. "You took my scarf," it hissed, each word dripping with malice. Dad stepped forward, brandishing a metal candlestick. "Stay away from my family." He swung at the creature, but his arm passed through it as if striking smoke. The entity moved swiftly, knocking him aside with a force that sent him crashing into the wall. "Run!" Mom screamed. We bolted from the closet, scrambling past the creature. The house had become a labyrinth of shadows, walls seeming to shift and stretch. Cold seeped into my bones with each step. We stumbled into the living room, the front door in sight. As we reached for the handle, the scarf slithered around the doorknob like a snake, pulling it out of reach. "You're not going anywhere." The voice echoed around us. Windows frosted over instantly, glass cracking under the sudden temperature drop. The lights flickered before plunging us into darkness. "Stay together," Mom urged, pulling us close. A figure emerged from the shadows, this time resembling Dad's silhouette but distorted. Limbs elongated. It wore the scarf, the ends floating as if underwater. "Dad!" Tommy whimpered. "That's not your father," Mom said firmly. The figure tilted its head. "Don't you recognize me?" Its face morphed, features shifting to mimic Dad's, then Mom's, then even Tommy's. "Stop it," I shouted. It laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "You invited me when you gave me the scarf. Now, I think I'll stay." Desperation fueled me. "What do you want?" It leaned closer, to be warm again. An idea sparked. "The fireplace," I whispered to Mom. She understood immediately. "Keep it distracted." I inched toward the hearth, where embers still glowed faintly. Grabbing the bottle of lighter fluid Dad kept nearby, I doused a log and threw it onto the coals. Flames roared to life, casting flickering light across the room. The creature recoiled, its form wavering. "What are you doing? Maybe you need to chill out," I retorted, grabbing a piece of burning wood with the fireplace tongs. I thrust it toward the entity. It shrieked, the sound piercing. The heat intensified, and the shadows retreated. Mom joined me, tossing cushions and anything flammable into the fire to keep it blazing. The creature writhed, shrinking away from the light and warmth. "You cannot get rid of me so easily." Dad stumbled into the room, clutching his side. "Everyone, outside." We didn't hesitate. With the creature momentarily weakened, the scarf's grip on the door loosened. We yanked it open and dashed into the night. The cold air was a shock, but we didn't stop running until we reached the neighbor's house. Lights glowing warmly in the windows. They took us in without question, calling the authorities. When the police arrived, our house stood silent and dark. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of the night's terror, except for Dad's scarf, singed and lying on the living room floor. They chalked it up to a break-in gone wrong, perhaps a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But we knew the truth. We never returned to that house. Relatives helped us relocate, and slowly, we rebuilt our lives. Dad never wore that scarf again. In fact, we burned it, just to be safe. Years later, on particularly cold nights, I sometimes think about that Christmas, about how something as simple as a gesture of kindness could invite darkness into our lives. I've come to understand that some things are better left untouched, some traditions left unmade. So when you build your snowmen, be careful what you adorn them with, because you never know what might take it as an invitation. And if you ever hear footsteps in the snow when no one should be there, or see something moving just beyond the edge of the light, trust your instincts, lock your doors, stoke your fires, and pray that the cold doesn't find its way inside. Story number 2. I never imagined that a simple getaway could turn into the most harrowing experience of my life. It was supposed to be a romantic Christmas retreat, just me and Mark, tucked away in a cozy cabin deep within the Maine woods. We'd both been swamped with work and craved an escape from the relentless pace of city life. When Mark found the listing for the secluded cabin, it seemed perfect. No neighbors for miles, a fireplace to keep us warm, and the promise of fresh snowfall to make the holiday feel truly magical. We set off early on Christmas Eve, the car packed with groceries, gifts, and enough firewood to last us through the weekend. The drive was long but beautiful. Towering pines lined the winding road, their branches heavy with snow. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the GPS signal faded, but Mark assured me he remembered the directions. By the time we arrived, dusk was settling in. The cabin stood in a small clearing, its wooden exterior blending seamlessly with the surroundings. But what caught my eye immediately was the snowman standing directly in front of the porch steps. It was unusually large, nearly 7 feet tall, with an old, tattered hat perched atop its head. Its face was rudimentarily crafted with black charcoal, giving it an almost grim expression. "Looks like someone left us a welcoming committee," Mark joked. I laughed nervously. Maybe the last guests got a bit creative. We unloaded the car, lugging our bags and supplies inside. The cabin was just as charming as advertised. A stone fireplace, rustic furniture, and a large window overlooking the forest. Yet, despite the warmth inside, I couldn't shake a subtle unease. The snowman seemed out of place, almost intrusive. "Do you think we should move it?" I asked, Peering out the window, Mark shrugged. It's just a snowman. Emily, adds to the festive spirit. Don't you think? I nodded, forcing a smile. You're right. I'm probably just tired. We spent the evening settling in, cooking dinner, and enjoying the silence that only such isolation can bring. As night fell, so did the snow, gentle flakes turning into a steady downfall. We sat by the fire, sipping wine and reminiscing about past holidays. Around 10 p.m., I decided to head to bed. Mark wanted to stay up a bit longer to read. As I climbed the stairs to the loft bedroom, I glanced out the window. The snowman was still there, but something seemed different. I dismissed it as a trick of the light and pulled the curtains closed. Sometime during the night, I awoke to the sound of soft tapping. I listened intently, wondering if branches were brushing against the cabin in the storm. The tapping continued, irregular but persistent. Mark was sound asleep beside me. Curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of bed, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and walked over to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Peered out. The snowman was closer. It now stood at the very edge of the porch, just a few feet from the front door. The hat drooped over one side of its head, and the charcoal features seemed more defined, almost sharper. My heart skipped a beat. Mark, I whispered urgently, shaking him gently. Mark, wake up. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. What is it? The snowman. It's moved. He squinted at me, half asleep. Moved? What are you talking about? It's right up against the porch now. It was by the steps earlier. He sat up, sighing. Snowmen don't just move. Maybe you're mistaken. I frowned. I'm sure of it. He got out of bed and joined me at the window. Even if it did, probably just the wind or the snow causing it to shift. I wanted to believe him. Maybe you're right. Come back to bed, he said, kissing my forehead. It's late. I settled back under the covers, but sleep eluded me. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind set my nerves on edge. Eventually, exhaustion took over. The next morning, Christmas Day, I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of bacon sizzling. Mark was already up, humming softly in the kitchen. Merry Christmas. He greeted me with a smile. Merry Christmas, I replied, momentarily soothed by the normalcy. Over breakfast, I decided not to mention the snowman. Perhaps I'd overreacted. After all, we were here to relax. Want to go for a hike later? Mark suggested. The snow's stopped, and the sun's peeking out. Sounds good, I agreed. As we prepared to head out, I glanced toward the porch. The snowman was still there, but now it stood directly in front of the door, blocking our exit. Okay, that's definitely not normal, I said, pointing. Mark looked puzzled. That's weird. See? I told you it moved. He frowned. Maybe some kids are messing with us. There are no other cabins nearby. I reminded him. He opened the door cautiously, stepping out to examine the snowman. Hello? He called out, looking around. The forest remained silent. He turned back to me. It's just a snowman. Let's move it. Together, we pushed it aside. But as my hands pressed against the cold snow, I felt something hard beneath the surface, something solid. There's something inside, I said, stepping back. Mark dug into the snow, revealing a piece of wood carved into a crude humanoid shape. Symbols were etched into it, unlike anything I'd ever seen. That's unsettling, he admitted. Can we just get rid of it? Pleaded. He nodded, tossing the wooden figure into the woods. We dismantled the snowman, scattering the snow across the yard. Feel better? He asked. A little. We set off on our hike, trying to put the odd incident behind us. The scenery was breathtaking, the fresh snow glittering under the sun. For a while, I felt the tension ease. By the time we returned, dusk was approaching. As we neared the cabin, I felt my stomach drop. The snowman was back. It stood in the exact spot we'd first found it. The hat now more tattered. The charcoal face twisted into what looked like a sneer. "This isn't possible," Mark whispered. "Someone has to be doing this," I said, my voice shaking. "This isn't funny," he called out again, anger edging his tone. "Whoever's out there, show yourself." Silence. "Let's go inside," he suggested, glancing around warily. We locked the doors and windows, drawing the curtains tight. Mark tried to reassure me, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "Maybe we should leave," I said. "It's late," he replied. "The roads might be dangerous with all the snow. Let's wait until morning." Reluctantly, I agreed. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. It echoed from different parts of the cabin, the walls, the windows, even the roof. Unable to ignore it any longer, we huddled together in the living room, a fire roaring in the hearth. "This is insane," Mark muttered. "I'm calling the owner." He dialed the number from the rental agreement, but the call wouldn't go through. "No signal," he said, staring at his phone. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging us into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight from the mantel, the beam cutting through the shadows. A loud thud resonated from the front door, followed by the unmistakable sound of scratching. "Who's there?" Mark demanded, moving toward the door. "Don't open it," I warned. He hesitated, then slowly approached the window beside the door, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek through. He staggered back, his face pale. "It's the Snowman," he whispered. "It's right up against the door." I felt a surge of terror. This can't be happening. The scratching intensified, more frantic now. "Back door," Mark said decisively. "We need to get to the car." We grabbed our coats and moved swiftly toward the kitchen. As we reached the back door, we heard a shattering sound from the front, the window breaking. "Go," Mark urged. We burst out into the cold night, racing toward the car parked a few yards away. The snow was deeper than before, slowing our movements. As we fumbled with the keys, I glanced back at the cabin. Silhouetted against the broken window was a figure, tall and misshapen, with elongated limbs made of snow and shadow. Its eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpricks of malevolent light. "Mark!" I screamed. He got the car unlocked, and we dove inside. The engine sputtered before roaring to life. We tore out of the driveway, the tires slipping on the icy path. "Did you see that?" I gasped, adrenaline surging through me. He nodded grimly. "We're getting out of here." We navigated the winding road as fast as conditions allowed. The trees loomed overhead, their branches forming a tunnel that seemed endless. After what felt like hours, we reached the main highway. The tension eased slightly, but questions swirled in my mind. "What was that thing?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we're safe now." We drove through the night until we reached a motel in the nearest town. Exhausted and shaken, we checked in and collapsed onto the bed. The next morning, we contacted the rental agency to report what had happened. The representative sounded confused. "Ma'am, there must be some mistake," she said. "We don't have any cabins listed in that area." "What do you mean?" I replied, incredulous. "We booked it through your website." She paused. "Our records show no such booking. Are you sure you used our service?" I handed the phone to Mark, who tried to sort it out, but the conversation led nowhere. We returned to the area with local authorities, but when we reached the spot, there was nothing, no cabin, no clearing, just dense forest. "This isn't possible," Mark whispered, bewildered. The officers exchanged glances. "Folks, there's no structures out here for miles. Are you sure this is the place?" We insisted it was, but without any evidence. There was little they could do. Back at the motel, we tried to make sense of it all. Our belongings, which we'd left in the cabin in our haste, were gone. The car showed no signs of the journey we'd taken, the odometer unchanged. No mud or snow on the tires. Are we losing our minds? I wondered aloud. Mark took my hand. We experienced it, whatever it was. We decided to return home, hoping distance would offer clarity. But even now, weeks later, the memories haunt us. I see that snowman's face in my dreams, feel the icy grip of fear when I pass by snow-covered fields. We tried to find information about the area, searching for any reports of similar incidents, legends, anything that could explain what we encountered. Our efforts yielded nothing concrete, only fragments of folklore about spirits in the woods and warnings to travelers. I don't know what happened during those 2 days, whether we stumbled into some place that wasn't meant to be found or if something attached itself to us. All I know is that when winter comes and the snow begins to fall, a deep unease settles within me, and sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I hear faint tapping at the window, accompanied by the whisper of wind carrying a chilling message. Welcome back. If you ever find yourself seeking solitude in a remote place, be careful where you tread. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed, and some welcomes are better left unaccepted. Story number 3. I always thought legends were just that. Stories passed down to scare kids into behaving or to add a little spice to a boring town's history. Growing up in a small Canadian town nestled between endless forests and frozen lakes, we heard our fair share of them. But there was one legend that stood out, whispered among us teenagers with a mix of skepticism and a thrill-seeking desire to test the unknown. They called it the Bloody Snowman. The tale went that if you built a snowman using red snow, stained by the berries of the winterberry bushes that dotted the outskirts, you would summon an evil entity. Most dismissed it as a morbid twist on traditional snowman building. But for me and my friends, it was the perfect dare for a Christmas Eve adventure. There were 5 of us: me, Jake, my best friend Tom, his girlfriend Lisa, her cousin Mike, and Sarah, the new girl who'd moved from Toronto and was eager to fit in. We were all gathered at Tom's house, a cozy log cabin on the edge of town. The adults were inside, engrossed in festive chatter, leaving us teens to our own devices. Come on, it's just a stupid story, Tom scoffed, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Then you shouldn't have any problem trying it, Sarah challenged, her eyes gleaming under the moonlight. Lisa hugged herself tightly. I don't know, guys, maybe we shouldn't mess with this stuff. Mike laughed, scared. Lisa, it's just berries and snow. I grinned, feeling the adrenaline. All right, let's do it. But where do we find these berries? Tom pointed toward the dark silhouette of the forest. There's a bunch of winterberry bushes by the old logging road. We grabbed flashlights and trudged through the knee-deep snow, our boots crunching loudly in the silent night. The town's Christmas lights faded behind us as we ventured deeper into the woods. The trees loomed overhead, their branches like skeletal arms reaching toward the star-studded sky. Over here, Mike called out, his flashlight beam illuminating a cluster of bushes adorned with bright red berries. We set to work, collecting as many as we could. Our gloves stained crimson as the berries burst in our hands. Back in an open clearing, we mashed them into buckets of snow, turning it a vivid shade of red. This looks unsettling, Lisa murmured, her face pale. That's the point. Tom smirked. Ready to build the most terrifying snowman this town's ever seen? We piled the red snow into 3 large spheres, stacking them carefully. Mike found some sticks for arms, and Sarah produced a pair of old, tarnished coins from her pocket for the eyes. Where'd you get those? I asked. Found them in the attic when we moved in, she replied nonchalantly. Thought they'd add a nice touch. Finally, Tom carved a wide, jagged grin into the face. Stepping back, we admired, or rather, nervously regarded our creation. Well, there it is, I said, trying to sound casual. But something about the snowman unsettled me. Under the moon's glow, the red snow looked disturbingly like frozen blood. Okay, we've done it. Can we go back now? Lisa pleaded. Wait, Sarah said. There's one last part of the legend. We have to say the summoning words. Tom raised an eyebrow. Summoning words? You didn't mention that before. She shrugged. Must have slipped my mind. Mike chuckled. All right, lay it on us. Sarah closed her eyes and recited in a low voice. From snow of red and night so black, we call thee forth. There's no turning back. With frozen breath and eyes of coal, come to us and claim your toll. A gust of wind whipped through the clearing, extinguishing our flashlights. We stood in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon. That was creepy, Tom muttered. Time to go, Lisa insisted. We didn't argue. As we made our way back to Tom's house, I glanced over my shoulder. The snowman stood motionless, but for a split second, I thought I saw it lean ever so slightly forward. Back at the cabin, the warmth and light were a welcome relief. We joined the others, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. The rest of the evening was uneventful, filled with holiday cheer and the comfort of familiarity. Around midnight, the guests began to leave, and we decided to call it a night. Tom's parents had set up sleeping arrangements for us since the weather had taken a turn for the worse. Heavy snow now falling steadily. I was assigned the guest room on the ground floor. Exhausted, I sank into the soft mattress, the events of the night replaying in my mind. Just as I was drifting off, a faint tapping sound pulled me back to consciousness. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, listening intently. It seemed to be coming from the window. Cautiously, I pulled back the curtain. Nothing, just the swirling snowflakes illuminated by the porch light. Probably a tree branch, I mumbled, settling back down. I had barely closed my eyes when the tapping resumed. Louder this time, heart pounding. I looked again. This time, I saw faint impressions on the frosted glass, like fingerprints slowly sliding down. Tom, I called out, thinking it might be a prank. No answer. A shadow moved just beyond the reach of the light. I caught a glimpse of something tall and misshapen. Gathering my courage, I threw on a jacket and headed to find the others. In the hallway, I bumped into Lisa. Did you hear that? She whispered, her eyes wide. The tapping? She nodded. I think someone's outside my window. We found Tom and Mike in the living room, both looking uneasy. Let me guess, Tom said. You guys heard it too? Before we could answer, Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs. Guys, something's wrong. We gathered in the living room, the atmosphere tense. It's just someone messing with us, Mike said, though he didn't sound convinced. Or maybe it's, Lisa began, but trailed off. The snowman finished. That's ridiculous, Tom snapped, but his clenched fists betrayed his fear. A sudden thud came from the front door, followed by a slow, deliberate knock. Knock, knock, knock. We froze. Who could that be at this hour? Sarah whispered. Tom approached the door cautiously. Who is it? He called out. Silence. He motioned for us to stay back and peek through the peephole. His face went pale. What is it? I demanded. There's no one there. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. Without thinking, Mike unlocked the door and yanked it open. A blast of icy wind swept in, but the porch was empty. Fresh snow covered the steps, untouched. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. We huddled together, fear gripping us. We need to stay inside, Sarah said firmly. All of us, together. We retreated to the living room, locking all the doors and windows. The fireplace offered little comfort as shadows danced along the walls. Hours passed in tense silence. Just when we thought the worst was over, the scratching began, faint at first, like nails running across the wooden exterior, then more pronounced, circling the house. This can't be happening, Lisa whimpered. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace. We can't just sit here. Agreed, Tom said, grabbing a heavy candlestick. We should confront whoever is doing this. Are you insane? Sarah snapped. That's exactly what it wants. What wants? Mike asked. She took a deep breath. The entity, the one from the legend. Tom scoffed. You can't seriously believe that. Can you explain what's happening? She retorted. Before he could answer, the power went out, plunging us into darkness. Stay calm, I said, though my own voice shook. We used our phone's flashlights to navigate. The scratching intensified, now accompanied by distant, echoing laughter. Check the breaker, Tom suggested. I'll go, I volunteered. Not alone, Sarah insisted. Together, we made our way to the basement door. The steps creaked ominously as we descended. The air grew colder, our breaths visible even in the dim light. At the bottom, we found the breaker box. I flipped the switches, but nothing happened. That's odd, I murmured. A soft crunching sound came from behind us. We turned slowly to see footprints appearing in the dusty floor, one after another, approaching us. Run, I yelled. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind us. Something's in the house, I gasped to the others. Panic set in. Lisa was sobbing, and even Tom looked terrified. We need to get out of here, Mike urged. Into the storm? Sarah questioned. We might not make it. Better than staying here, Tom decided. We gathered our coats and shoes, preparing to make a dash for the cars. As we opened the front door, we were met with a horrifying sight. The snowman stood at the foot of the steps, but it had changed. It was larger, its arms now long and twisted, ending in sharp, claw-like fingers. The coins that served as its eyes glowed faintly, and the jagged grin seemed to widen. It's blocking our way, Lisa whispered. We'll have to go out the back, I suggested. We retreated, but as we reached the kitchen, we saw the same monstrous figure through the glass doors, standing in the backyard. It's impossible, Tom stammered. It's everywhere, Sarah said grimly. The scratching began anew, this time from the windows all around us. Multiple shadows loomed outside, their forms indistinct but undeniably threatening. We're surrounded, Mike realized. Suddenly, the windows shattered, a flurry of snow and ice bursting into the house. The figures advanced, moving unnaturally, their limbs bending at grotesque angles. Upstairs, I shouted. We raced up, barricading ourselves in Tom's bedroom. What do we do now? Lisa cried. There has to be a way out, Tom said, his eyes darting around. The attic, Sarah suggested. We can access the roof. With no better option, we climbed the narrow ladder into the attic. The space was cluttered with old furniture and boxes. A small window offered a potential escape. Mike smashed it open, and one by one, we crawled onto the snow-covered roof. The storm had intensified, wind howling as snow whipped against our faces. Careful, Tom warned. It's slippery. We inched our way toward the tree adjacent to the house, planning to climb down. A piercing shriek cut through the air. From below, the figures emerged, their eyes glowing up at us. Hurry, I urged. Lisa went first, gripping the branches tightly. As she descended, one of the figures reached up, grabbing her ankle. She screamed, losing her grip. We watched in horror as she was pulled into the mass of swirling snow and shadows. Lisa, Tom yelled, starting down after her. Wait, Sarah grabbed his arm, but he shook her off. He disappeared into the white abyss. Moments later, his screams were silenced. We have to keep moving, Mike said, his voice strained. We made our way across the roof toward a neighboring tree that led further away from the house. Sarah slipped but caught herself. As we reached the tree, Mike went first, successfully making it down. I helped Sarah, but as she began her descent, a sharp pain shot through my leg. I looked down to see a clawed hand gripping my ankle, icy cold seeping into my bones. Jake, Sarah cried. Go, I shouted, kicking frantically. She hesitated, then continued down. The grip tightened, pulling me backward. I clawed at the roof, but the surface was too slick. Help! I screamed as I was dragged toward the edge. Mike appeared below, eyes wide with helplessness. "Hold on," he yelled, but it was too late. I was pulled over the side, falling into the swirling mass below. Darkness enveloped me. I awoke to silence. The storm had passed, and the first light of dawn was breaking. I was lying in the snow, the cold biting deep. Groaning, I sat up. The house stood silent, windows shattered, doors ajar. There was no sign of the others. Tom? Lisa? Mike? Sarah? I called out weakly. No response. I stumbled back into the house, searching every room. They were gone. Despair settled over me. I grabbed a phone and dialed the emergency services. When the authorities arrived, they found me alone, rambling about snowmen and shadows. Their search yielded nothing. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, nothing to support my story. In the days that followed, the town mourned the disappearance of 4 teenagers. I was met with sympathy, but also skepticism. Whispers circulated that I'd lost my mind, that perhaps I was responsible. But I know what happened. A week later, as I was packing to leave town, I glanced out the window and froze. In the distance stood the bloody snowman, unchanged, his coins glinting in the sunlight. But this time, for sets of claw marks adorned its surface. I realized then that the legend was true, and the entity had claimed its toll. I left that day, vowing never to return. But even now, on cold winter nights, I hear the faint scratching at my window and the distant echo of a jagged grin. So if you ever hear the tale of the bloody snowman, heed my warning. Some legends are best left alone. Story number 4. I never considered myself a superstitious man. Growing up in the heart of New England, I'd heard my fair share of ghost stories and local legends, but they were just that, stories, tall tales spun to entertain or scare the gullible. Even as a child, I was more interested in facts than folklore. So, when I tell you that what happened to me on Christmas Eve is something I can't explain, I hope you'll understand the weight of my words. It was late, later than I'd intended to be out. The holiday season always brought with it a rush of last-minute tasks, and this year was no exception. I'd spent the evening at my sister's house, helping her assemble a gift for my nephew that had arrived in pieces and with instructions that might as well have been in hieroglyphics. By the time we finished, snow had begun to fall big, fluffy flakes that blanketed the world in white and muffled the usual sounds of the town. "Stay the night, Jack," my sister had urged, concern etched on her face. "The roads are getting bad." "I'll be fine," I assured her, pulling on my coat. "It's only a 20-minute drive, and I've handled worse." She'd hugged me tightly, her worry palpable. "Be careful." I waved her off with a smile, but as I stepped outside, the cold bit deeper than I'd expected. The streets were nearly deserted, the holiday lights glowing softly through the veil of snow. I brushed off my car and set off, the tires crunching over the fresh layer that had already accumulated. The route home took me past Hollow Brook Cemetery, one of the oldest in the state. By day, it was a picturesque place. Ancient headstones nestled among towering oaks, a wrought iron fence encircling the grounds. But at night, under the dim glow of the street lamps, it transformed into something else entirely. As I approached the cemetery, the snowfall intensified, the road became slick, and I eased off the gas, navigating carefully through the turns. That's when I saw it. A large figure standing just beyond the fence line, illuminated by my headlights. First, I thought it was a person, perhaps stranded or in need of help. But as I drew closer, details emerged. It was a snowman, towering and imposing, positioned right next to a weathered gravestone near the entrance gate. "That's odd," I muttered to myself. Who would build a snowman here? Of all places, curiosity gnawed at me, without fully realizing why. I felt compelled to stop. I pulled over to the side of the road, leaving the engine running and the headlights piercing through the curtain of snow. I stepped out of the car, the cold air stealing my breath. The snow crunching underfoot was the only sound as I approached the fence. Close. The snowman was even more striking. He stood at least 7 feet tall, crafted with an attention to detail that was unsettling. The body was smooth, almost sculpted, and the face, God, the face. It wasn't the typical arrangement of coal eyes and a carrot nose. Instead, the features were meticulously carved into the snow, resembling a human face with an uncanny realism. The eyes were deep-set hollows, shadowed and lifelike. The nose was straight and proportional, and the mouth was a thin line that curved upward ever so slightly at the corners. A shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Someone has too much time on their hands, I thought, but even in my mind, the joke fell flat. I glanced around, half expecting to see the artist lurking nearby, but the cemetery was still. The snow muffled any distant sounds, creating an eerie silence. I turned back to the snowman, and that's when I noticed it. The eyes seemed to be looking directly at me. I blinked, shaking my head. It was a trick of the light. Surely, the way the shadows played across the contours of the face could create that illusion. But then the mouth twitched. I froze, heart pounding. Had I really seen that? My rational mind fought against the surge of fear. Snowmen don't move. Gathering my courage, I decided to get a closer look. Maybe the wind had shifted some of the snow. Yes, that was it. I unlatched the gate, its iron hinges protesting with a groan. The path leading into the cemetery was barely visible under the fresh snow. I hesitated for a moment, but then pushed forward, my footsteps crunching loudly in the quiet night. As I approached the snowman, the air seemed to grow heavier, each breath forming thick clouds that hung in the air. I was now just a few feet away, and the details of the face were even more pronounced. It was as if someone had captured a person's likeness in snow, a memorial. Perhaps, is this some kind of tribute? I wondered aloud, reaching out. I brushed my fingers against the surface. The snow was cold and firm, but beneath it, I felt something harder, more solid. Startled, I pulled my hand back. What the hell? I looked down at my hand and saw that my fingertips were stained red, blood red. Panic surged through me. I stumbled back, tripping over a hidden gravestone and falling onto the snow-covered ground. Pain shot through my ankle, but adrenaline pushed it aside. As I scrambled to my feet, the snowman began to change. The features of the face started to soften, the edges blurring as if it were melting. But the temperature hadn't risen. In fact, it felt colder than ever. Then, before my eyes, the entire structure collapsed inward, the snow falling in on itself without a sound. Left in its place was a small object sticking up from the snow. I hesitated, torn between the urge to flee and an inexplicable compulsion to see what it was. Cautiously, I stepped forward and reached down to pick it up. It was a note, folded neatly and surprisingly dry despite the snow. My name was written on the outside in elegant cursive. My mouth went dry. How did someone know my name? With trembling hands, I unfolded the paper. Inside, a single sentence was written. "Thank you for stopping." A gust of wind whipped past me, carrying the note from my grasp. It danced away into the darkness, lost among the headstones. I didn't wait another second. I turned and ran, ignoring the sharp pain in my ankle, bursting through the gate. I raced back to my car and threw myself inside, locking the doors out of some irrational fear. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The cemetery lay still, the gate swinging slightly in the wind. What the hell just happened? I whispered, my breath fogging the interior of the car. I needed to get out of there. Shifting into drive, I pulled back onto the road, tires slipping briefly on the slick surface. As I sped away, a figure appeared in my peripheral vision, a silhouette standing by the side of the road. I glanced over, but there was nothing there, just shadows. Keep it together, Jack, I told myself. The rest of the drive home was a blur. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house was dark. Of course, I'd forgotten to leave the lights on. Inside, I went straight to the bathroom to wash my hands, the memory of the red stain vivid in my mind. But when I looked down, my fingers were clean, no trace of blood or anything else. I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection. Tired eyes stared back, framed by dark circles. "You're exhausted," I reasoned, overworked and overtired. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the snowman's face, those hollow eyes boring into me. When I did drift off, my dreams were filled with fragmented images. A snowy graveyard, whispers carried on the wind, and a sense of being watched. I woke up drenched in sweat, the room freezing despite the heater humming steadily. The clock on the nightstand read 3:15 a.m. Great, I muttered. Merry Christmas to me. Deciding that sleep was futile, I got up and made my way to the kitchen. As I passed by the living room window, something caught my eye. Across the street, illuminated by the soft glow of a street lamp, stood a snowman. It was identical to the one in the cemetery. My heart leaped into my throat. This was impossible. I moved closer to the window, peering through the frost-laced glass. The snowman stood motionless, but it was facing my house, facing me. A sudden knock at the front door made me jump. It was a soft, almost hesitant sound. I hesitated. Who would be knocking at this hour? The knock came again, slightly more insistent. Taking a deep breath, I approached the door. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice wavering. No answer. I looked through the peephole, but the lens was fogged over, obscuring the view. Maybe it's a neighbor, I thought, though I knew how unlikely that was. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. No one was there. Cold air rushed in, and I shivered, stepping out onto the porch. I looked around. The street was empty, the snow-covered sidewalks undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading away from my house and disappearing around the corner. I glanced back at the snowman across the street, but it was gone. Fear tightened its grip on me. I retreated inside, bolting the door and checking the locks twice over. "You're losing it," I whispered. This can't be real, determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head. I grabbed my coat and boots. If the snowman was gone, there would be tracks where someone had moved it. I stepped outside, the snow crunching underfoot as I crossed the street. The spot where the snowman had stood was pristine, untouched. "That's not possible," I murmured. A sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, and for a moment, I thought I heard a faint whisper. "Jack!" I spun around, scanning the area. "Who's there?" Silence. I backed away, nearly slipping on a patch of ice. Panic was setting in, and I needed to get back inside. As I turned to hurry home, I saw them, footprints in the snow, leading from where the snowman had been, straight to my front door. My mind raced. Had someone been watching me, playing a prank? But who knew about the cemetery? Who knew where I lived? I followed the footprints back to my house. They ended abruptly at the porch steps. Heart pounding, I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't turn. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. Leaning against the door, I tried to catch my breath. "Think, Jack, think." My phone was on the kitchen counter. I could call someone, anyone, to help make sense of this. But as I entered the kitchen, I stopped short. Lying on the table was the note from the cemetery. Unfolded, the same elegant cursive stared back at me. "Thank you for stopping." I felt the room spin. This wasn't possible. The note had blown away. Cold draft brushed past me, and I heard the faint sound of footsteps upstairs. "Is someone there?" I called out, dread seeping into every fiber of my being. No response. I needed to leave. Now, I headed for the front door, but it refused to open. The locks wouldn't budge, and the handle felt like ice against my skin. Trapped. A creaking sound came from the staircase. Slowly, I turned to see a shadow descending the steps. A tall figure, movements slow and deliberate. As it came into view, I saw it clearly. It was the snowman, or rather, a man made of snow, the same lifelike face gazing at me with hollow eyes. "Stay away," I shouted, backing into the corner. It continued toward me, leaving wet footprints on the hardwood floor. "Why are you doing this?" pleaded. It stopped a few feet away, tilting its head slightly. Then, in a voice that sounded like the crunch of snow underfoot, it spoke. "You saw me. I don't understand," I stammered. "I've waited so long for someone to see me. What do you want?" "To be remembered." The room grew colder, frost creeping along the walls. "How can I help you?" I asked, desperation overtaking fear. It extended a hand toward me, fingers elongated and crystalline. "Join me." I shook my head violently. "No, I can't." I stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You have no choice." Summoning every ounce of courage, I darted past it, heading for the back door. I followed, movements fluid yet unnatural. Reaching the door, I yanked it open and stumbled into the backyard. The snow was deep, slowing my steps as I pushed toward the fence. Behind me, the entity emerged from the house, unhindered by the terrain. I reached the fence and climbed over, dropping into the alleyway. My car keys were still in my pocket. If I could just make it to the garage, I might escape. I navigated through the maze of back streets, the snowstorm intensifying. The wind howled, and shadows seemed to move at the edges of my vision. Finally, I reached the garage, fumbling with the keys. I unlocked the car and jumped in, locking the doors. The engine sputtered to life, and I peeled out onto the street. "Just keep driving," I told myself. "Don't stop." I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than here. As I drove through the deserted streets, the snowfall lessened, and the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon. Exhausted, I pulled into an all-night diner on the outskirts of town. Inside, the warmth and normalcy were a stark contrast to the terror I just experienced. I sat at the counter, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The waitress gave me a concerned look. "Rough night?" she asked. "You have no idea," I replied, managing a weak smile. I considered calling my sister, but decided against it. What would I even say? After an hour, I felt somewhat calmer. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered landscape. Maybe it's over, I thought. I paid my bill and stepped outside. The air was crisp but lacked the oppressive chill from before. As I approached my car, I noticed something on the windshield, a folded note. My heart sank. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. "Thank you for stopping." I dropped the note and looked around. The parking lot was empty, the road quiet, but in the distance, atop a small hill overlooking the diner, stood the snowman. Even from afar, I could feel its gaze. I knew then that it would never stop. It had marked me somehow, bound me to its world. I got into my car and drove away, leaving everything behind. That was a year ago. I've moved across the country, changed my name, tried to start anew. But every winter, when the snow falls, I feel its presence, in reflections, in fleeting shadows, in the quiet moments of the night. And each time, a note appears. "Thank you for stopping." I don't know who or what it is, a restless spirit, a manifestation of loneliness, or something far older and more sinister. All I know is that I made the mistake of acknowledging it, and now it will never let me go. So if you ever see a snowman in an unexpected place, with a face too real to be mere snow, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look back, because some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Story number 5. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, monsters under the bed, things that go bump in the night, they were all just stories to me. Tales told around campfires or in dimly lit rooms during sleepovers. But that was before last Christmas, when something happened that I still struggle to understand. Even now, years later, the memories haunt me, creeping into my thoughts when I least expect them. It was Christmas Day in Wisconsin, and the world was draped in a thick blanket of snow. The kind of snow that absorbs sound and makes everything feel muted, almost peaceful. I was 10 years old, full of the boundless energy that only a child possesses. After the excitement of unwrapping gifts had subsided, I bundled up in my warmest coat, gloves, and boots, eager to explore the winter wonderland outside. "Don't stay out too long, Daniel." My mom called from the kitchen, where she was preparing our Christmas dinner. "I won't," I shouted back, already halfway out the door. Our backyard stretched out into a small forest of pine trees, their branches heavy with snow. The air was crisp, each breath forming little clouds that drifted lazily upward. I decided to build a snowman. What better way to celebrate a white Christmas? I worked diligently, rolling the snow into 3 large balls and stacking them carefully. I used stones for the eyes and mouth, and an old scarf my dad had discarded to give it some character. For the nose, I borrowed a carrot from the kitchen when Mom wasn't looking. Stepping back, I admired my handiwork. The snowman stood tall and proud, its featureless gaze aimed toward the house. "Perfect," I whispered to myself. As evening approached, the sky turned a deep shade of purple, and the first stars began to twinkle. Mom called me inside, insisting I get cleaned up before dinner. I gave the snowman a final glance before heading in, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. Dinner was a cozy affair, just me, Mom, and Dad, sharing stories and laughter around the dining table. Afterward, we settled in the living room to watch a Christmas movie. The warmth of the fireplace made me drowsy, and I could feel my eyelids growing heavy. "Time for bed, champ," Dad said, ruffling my hair. I didn't protest. Climbing the stairs to my room, I changed into my pajamas and brushed my teeth. My bedroom window overlooked the backyard, and as I pulled the curtains closed, I saw the snowman standing silently in the moonlight. For a moment, I thought its head was tilted slightly, as if it were looking right at me. I shook off the eerie feeling and crawled into bed. Sometime during the night, a faint sound stirred me from sleep. First, I thought it was the wind, a soft whisper rustling through the trees. But then I heard it again, a distinct voice, barely audible. "Come out and play with me." I sat up, heart pounding. The room was dark, shadows stretching across the walls. I listened intently, but all was silent. "Just a dream," I told myself, lying back down. I closed my eyes, willing myself to drift off, but the whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Come out and play with me." I pulled the covers up to my chin, my mouth dry, gathering courage. I decided to peek out the window, just to reassure myself. Sliding out of bed, I crept toward the curtains and pulled them back ever so slightly. The snowman was closer. It now stood several feet nearer to the house, its body illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. The stones that formed its mouth were arranged differently, creating an eerie grin. The eyes seemed deeper, almost hollow. A chill ran down my spine. "This can't be," I whispered. I let the curtain fall back into place and stumbled back to bed, pulling the blankets over my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, repeating over and over that it was just my imagination. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually I fell asleep. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, and the events of the night before felt like a distant nightmare. I got dressed and headed downstairs, the smell of pancakes greeting me. "Morning, sleepyhead," Mom said cheerfully. "Morning," I replied, taking a seat at the table. Dad was reading the newspaper, sipping his coffee. "Looks like more snow is coming later today," he remarked. After breakfast, curiosity got the better of me. I needed to see the snowman in the light of day. Excusing myself, I bundled up and stepped outside. The snowman was gone. I stared at the spot where it had stood, confusion turning to disbelief. The snow was undisturbed, no signs that anything had been there at all. It was as if the snowman had never existed. "Mom," "Dad," called, rushing back inside. They appeared in the hallway, concern etched on their faces. "What is it?" Mom asked. "The snowman I built yesterday. It's gone." Dad raised an eyebrow. "Maybe it collapsed overnight." "No, the snow is untouched. There's no trace of it." They exchanged glances. "I'm sure there's an explanation," Dad said gently. "Maybe the wind knocked it over and covered the spot with fresh snow." I knew they were just trying to reassure me, but something felt wrong, very wrong. I spent the rest of the day indoors, the festive mood overshadowed by an unshakable unease. As evening fell, a heavy snowfall began, large flakes swirling outside the windows. "Looks like we're in for a blizzard," Dad commented, turning on the weather report. I tried to focus on a puzzle Mom and I were working on, but my mind kept drifting back to the snowman and the whispers I'd heard. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, listening to the howling wind. Around midnight, the whispers returned. "Come out and play with me." I sat up, my heart thudding in my chest. The voice was clearer now, undeniably real. "Come out and play with me." Summoning every ounce of courage, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I tiptoed to the window and pulled back the curtain. My breath caught in my throat. Pressed against the glass was the snowman's face. His grin wider, more sinister. The hollow eyes seemed to bore into mine. But what terrified me most were the small, icy hands made of snow, fingers elongated and pressed flat against the window pane. I stumbled backward. A scream caught in my throat. The room grew colder, my breath visible in the frigid air. "Come out and play with me." The voice was inside the room now, surrounding me. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and racing down the hall to my parents' bedroom. "Mom! Dad!" I cried, bursting through their door. They woke with a start. "Daniel, what's wrong?" Mom asked, reaching out to me. "It's the snowman. It's outside my window." Dad threw off the covers. "What are you talking about?" "He was there." He pressed his face against the window. Dad sighed, glancing at Mom. "It was just a bad dream, buddy." "No, I saw it." Mom pulled me into a hug. "You're okay now. It was just your imagination." Frustrated and scared, I insisted they come to my room. Reluctantly, they agreed. We walked back down the hall, and I hesitated before opening the door. The room was as I had left it, the window closed, curtains drawn. "See," Dad said softly, "nothing here. Check outside," I urged. He walked over and pulled the curtain aside. The snow was falling heavily, but there was nothing unusual. "Let's all get some sleep," Mom suggested, guiding me back to bed. They tucked me in, and after they left, I lay there, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The whispers didn't return, and eventually, exhaustion overtook me. Morning arrived with a peculiar stillness. I woke to the sound of muffled voices downstairs. Curious, I got up and made my way to the kitchen. Mom and Dad were standing by the back door, their faces pale. "What's going on?" I asked. They turned to me, trying to mask their worry. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just stay inside, okay?" I moved toward the door, but Dad blocked my path. "Daniel," I said, "stay inside." "Why? What's out there?" He hesitated, then sighed. "We found some footprints leading into the house." "Footprints?" Mom nodded. "They look like small footprints." A chill settled over me, like a child's. "Perhaps," Dad admitted, "but there's no other tracks. It's probably just an animal. Animals don't make footprints like a child." I said quietly. They exchanged another glance. "Let me see," I insisted. Reluctantly, Dad stepped aside. I opened the door and looked down. There, imprinted in the fresh snow, were small footprints leading from the spot where the snowman had stood directly to our back door. My mind raced. "But how?" "We're going to call the police," Mom said firmly, "just to be safe." The officers arrived shortly after. Two men bundled against the cold. They surveyed the scene. taking notes and asking questions. "No signs of forced entry," one of them said. "Are you sure all the doors were locked?" "Positive," Dad replied. "Windows?" "Yes, everything was locked." The officers exchanged looks. "Well, we'll keep an eye out in the neighborhood. Probably just some kids playing a prank." As they left, I felt a mix of fear and frustration. No one was taking this seriously. That night, I couldn't bear to be alone. I asked if I could sleep in my parents' room, and they agreed, sensing my distress. Sometime after midnight, a loud thump jolted me awake. I sat up, listening. There it was again, a heavy, deliberate thud from downstairs. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Mom stirred. "Go back to sleep." "Daniel." Another thud, followed by the creak of floorboards. Dad sat up, alert. "Stay here," he instructed, climbing out of bed. "Don't go," Mom pleaded. "I'll just take a quick look." He left the room, and moments later, we heard him descend the stairs. Silence stretched out, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, a blood-curdling scream echoed from below. Mom jumped up. "Stay here," she ordered, before rushing after Dad. But I couldn't stay put. I crept to the doorway, peering into the dark hallway. Faint noises drifted up, the sound of a struggle, muffled voices, gathering my courage. I made my way downstairs. The living room was empty, but the front door stood wide open, snow blowing in. I stepped outside, the cold biting through my pajamas. "Dad? Mom?" I called out. Footprints led away from the house, disappearing into the darkness. The snowfall was heavy, obscuring visibility. A whisper carried on the wind. "Come out and play with me." I turned to see the snowman standing at the edge of the yard, taller than before, his grin impossibly wide. Beside it stood two figures, my parents, faces blank, eyes void of any recognition. "Mom! Dad!" I shouted. They didn't respond. "Come join us, Daniel." The voices whispered in unison. Terror seized me. I stumbled back toward the house, slipping on the icy steps, scrambling inside. I slammed the door and locked it. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me. "Come out and play forever." I retreated to my room, heart pounding, and hid under the bed, shaking uncontrollably. The next thing I remember is waking up to sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but the house was empty. No signs of my parents. No notes. No messages. Their phones were still on the kitchen counter. Jackets hanging by the door. I called the police, trying to explain through sobs what had happened. They searched the area but found nothing. Days turned into weeks, and despite exhaustive efforts, my parents were never found. They say trauma can distort memories, especially in children. Over time, the official story became that my parents went for a walk during the storm and succumbed to the elements. An unfortunate accident. But I know what I saw. Now, years later, I've moved far away from Wisconsin, but the memories linger. Every winter, when the first snow falls, I feel a familiar dread. I've tried to move on, to build a life unmarred by that night. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I hear faint whispers calling to me, "Come out and play." And I wonder if one day, I might just give in. Thank you for joining us tonight on Enigma of the Unknown, where we unraveled the dark and terrifying side of Christmas snowmen. Remember, the next time you see a snowman in your yard, it might be more than just snow. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more eerie stories. Stay safe, stay warm, and keep an eye out because sometimes the snow hides more than just the cold.